Welcome to the 14th video in the series, The Character of the Communist Mode Production According to Marx and Engels. Today we'll be going over our first Engels piece in this series, the 1877 Anti-Dühring, Herr Eugene Dühring's Revolution in Science, and we will be going over part 3, Socialism. I've subtitled this Community as Free Association of Equal Producers. In this section of Anti-Dühring, Engels explicates the weakness of Dühring's utopian conception of socialism, addressing the problems within it. Through this, we can make determinations about the character of the communist mode of production by comparison. Engels splits this part into 5 chapters: historical, theoretical, production, distribution, and finally, state, family, education. He also reminds us that the communist mode of production emerges from the negation of the capitalist mode of production, and thus the societies of both are similar in relation. The proletariat, through its dictatorship, abolishes its own basis as a class, and thus the state is abolished. Communism is classless and stateless. Through this, the Gemeinwesen, the Commonalty, is produced, and as society develops, the Gemeinschaft, the true society, which is community as association, wherein people are free to associate with one another on the basis of their common humanity, without any external mediating force, living in harmony and reaching their full individual potential in and through society is constructed. Engels starts by establishing that the political rule of men, transformed into mere administration of things and direction of processes of production, is synonymous with the abolition of the state. He also makes it clear that, for society to be truly historically progressive, women must be fully emancipated, as that is the sign of degree of progress. Thus, communism as the highest degree of historical process, and the real movement which abolishes the present state of things, necessarily involves the end of all patriarchal relations in their entirety, ending the subjection of women and children to social power by way of ending the economic domination carried out by the father, and thereby the family in its current form. He also makes it clear that how wealth is distributed and the social division of labor is determined by 1. What is produced, 2. How it is produced, and 3. How the products are exchanged, the actual physical process of distribution. And to be clear here, we'll talk more about the character of family abolition and what's meant by that in a piece coming up very soon after this. So bear with this right now. I know that this is a rather, shall we say, contentious point, but it will be made clear in Origins of the Family. I have prepared something special directly for that, and also have recommendations on further reading if anybody is interested. Continuing, all social changes at their base are born out of the economic base. This is the basis of materialism, which rejects the conception that social change originates from either models inside people's minds or through pure philosophical investigation. Rather, those are born out of the conditions that exist within the forces and relations of production people find themselves within. As these forces and relations, that is, the mode of production develops, ideas change in response to it, and previous ideas from earlier modes of production are transformed. Thus, communism, as a mode of production that comes after capitalism, will have new ideas that come from the capitalist mode of production, but as it develops, these ideas will be transformed, sublated into new ideas that are in line with the new forces and relations of production. In addition, the very forces of production are developed in such a way that is in support of the relations of production at the given period. For example, machines are developed currently not to free living labor, but instead to place living labor under the control of dead labor. When the productive forces of a given historic period outstrip the relations of production, those relations become a fetter on them and hinder their development. It is at this point that it becomes possible for a social revolution, as opposed to a political or bourgeois revolution, to overthrow these relations and establish new ones, and doing so, the entire social order itself. Unlike previous relations, however, communism has no fetters, because it socializes the means of production and places them directly in the hands of the associated producers. Therefore, there are no fetters on their development, and thus communist society is capable of not only the most direct development of the productive forces, but the most rapid development of them. With the end of the boom and bust cycles and so on, endless development of the productive forces without ceasing becomes possible. With there no longer being a ruling class that appropriates all the surplus of society, everyone receives all they need for the fullest physical and mental development, allowing the full growth of all humans to their highest individual capacity. Communism involves a practical, real, and necessary recognition of the social nature of the forces of production, rather than the intellectually stated claim that class society uses. Through this recognition, there is a fundamental shift in the mode of production, appropriation, and social exchange within the socialized means of production to be harmonious and rational, such that relations are no longer based on class power and domination, but instead on mutual cooperation through collective ownership and control of the forces of production, such that they can be used optimally for humanity, both in the short and long term. Communism itself has become a historical necessity as the forces of production have reached such a development that they can only be held rationally by society as a whole, else the reality we are currently experiencing will only continue and worsen, degradation of nature and humans to self-destruction, with the forces of production outstripping us and ruling over us, such as developing climate crisis, the continual displacement of humans within the reproduction of society, and so on. This can only be stopped through all society taking the forces of production into our direct possession, as those means and products of social production which become utilized by the associated producers are necessarily utilized by those with perfect understanding of their nature. The workman is not going to demand more of himself or the machine than is possible, whereas those with no direct relation will necessarily over or underestimate the forces of production. In this society, therefore, the producers acting as the general intellect have all-round development, understanding in a real sense the scientific basis of industrial production as a whole, the practical experience in the entirety of all production from start to finish, and will therefore be able to make the best possible decisions about production as those engaging in the actual act of production without any sort of external force, making them associate and carry out production in particular ways. They will know what to produce, how to produce it, where everything goes, what is transported and where, and all other steps in the production process. In fact, production itself simplifies massively. For example, transport of raw materials and fuel reduces maximally, since society becomes equitably distributed, with the productive forces placed in the best places for them as decided by fully developed persons in a rational manner, rather than by according to what the market most thinks fits. The results of this will be a more or less equal distribution of modern industry across the whole world, and thus the division between town and country will fully come to an end. In communism, social reality and the mode of production become under the conscious control of society, rather than at the mercy of forces outside of it. The relations of production and the products themselves are clearly understood without any mediating force, and thus the products of social production cease being in opposition to humanity. Living labor becomes in harmony with dead labor, with the forces of production no longer outstripping us, and social anarchy of production ending with the institution of social regulation of production upon a definite plan that is drawn up according to the needs of the community and every single individual. This brings an end to the domination of the productive forces over the producers. Appropriation of the products of society becomes based on the nature of the socialized means of production, and as such it becomes completely unreasonable to claim that any one individual or group of individuals, quote, build this or that. Thus, direct social appropriation is employed both in order to develop and maintain the means of production. The social deductions which return to producers invariably as explicated in the critique of the Gotha program, along with direct individual appropriation for consumption. With the socialization of the means of production, production for use, and the harmony of living and dead labor, the anarchy of social production ends. Thus, value ceases, and the law of value loses hold on society. Instead, production is carried out with systemic, definite organization determined by the freely associated producers, wherein everyone is free from exploitation or class domination, able to decide of any of their own accord to produce and associate however they please, while enjoying the fruits of their labor with the ability to determine their own lives, having equal say in the decision-making process of society's production with dignity and respect. Competition and anarchy cease. Mankind, both society and individuals, are no longer ruled by forces outside themselves, but instead determine our own future and govern ourselves. We become masters of our own fate, both within nature and in history. History no longer happens to us as subjected entities, but rather we experience our own history according to our own free action. Mankind makes its own history, and thus freedom is finally achieved. Quote, "Communism is a riddle of history solved, and knows itself to be this solution." Marx's conception of labor vouchers, employed during the lower phase of communism, and I would argue in the dictatorship of the proletariat as well, by the way, never at any point operates as money, nor has any sort of natural inclination or social power to be able to be converted to it. In communism, socialized labor, which is done on means of production that are utilized in direct association, can be quantified directly and through daily experience. A given society can calculate the socially necessary average labor time in terms of both duration and intensity to produce any given product. In a rational society, there's no reason to present these in some relative, fluctuating form. Rather, it can instead express them in their direct and real measure, which can only be understood as time. Therefore, in this society, all products are recognized individually, without any process of comparison but was necessary for purposes of planning production. There is no process of social validation of labor, and thus no value. There's simply a social plan of production that is in line with the means of production and labor available, with the use value of the articles of consumption being the basis for determination of what's produced. At this point, balancing useful effects and expenditure of labor will be the only thing left for the associated producers to make decisions about. The state ceases at this point. The law of value, the fundamental law of commodity production that asserts itself in capitalism as a blindly operating law of nature, is not a transhistorical one, as Dühring's conception suggests, such as exists throughout all of history as a universal, unchanging law. Because Marx's labor vouchers do not exchange, labor time calculation is not being used to determine the value of goods and services through comparison, but instead allocate social products based on need. In-kind calculation is used for social purposes and for organizing production and distribution, not for comparison between labor and products. In addition, these labor vouchers are transitory and naturally trend towards removal as the common deductions increase with the development of communist society. The division of labor is replaced with an organization of production wherein all members of society engage in social labor that is no longer alienating, but instead becomes a means of emancipation, wherein labor becomes life's prime want. It develops everyone physically, mentally, and socially, and does so in all directions, while allowing for the greatest social activity. Fundamentally, the source of the division of labor, and thereby the material basis for the development of classes, is based on the underdevelopment of the productive forces. For the division of labor to be brought fully to an end beyond in the social realm, production thus needs to be such that the appropriation of the means of production and products is so great that there is no longer any need for society to make exclusionary determinations. A society able to do this can fully transcend bourgeois right and will have developed to such a degree that all members of it can engage in development of culture, intellectual leadership, and political activity. In fact, these are all necessary in Congress with the development of the productive forces. In addition to the end of the division of labor brought about by the developed productive forces, is also the resulting effects of it beyond class, but influenced by class. The division between town and country, which results in those in the city losing basis of physical development, which in turn harms mental development, and those in the country losing access to culture and intellectual work that causes them to be stunted. In addition, Those in purely intellectual forms of labor find themselves perceiving the world solely through a one-dimensional accounting based on their particular trade, and lack the ability to see what the needs of society and physical reality are. Through the development of the productive forces in the interest of social life rather than capitalist profit, it becomes possible not only to reduce the time laboring to produce what is necessary for the reproduction of society without specific interest in the people carrying out that production to keep doing it, thus allowing for full automation of the production process, but also to focus on particular forms of labor to automate, principally such that is undesirable. And to note, as we all know, within capitalist society it is usually the worst jobs that are the worst paid and the least automated. This is obviously something that makes no sense rationally, but is completely rational within capitalist society. Continuing, but it's the other way around within communist society. Continuing. Thus, people can begin to engage only in purely fulfilling labor. This will allow for the development of a scientific society wherein labor is carried out in the form of the watchmen, looking over the natural forces at play, producing of their own accord at the direction of the watchmen. Strict specialization becomes no longer necessary, as was the case in the guild system and the like. In fact, specialization becomes a fetter to production, as it reduces the productive capacity of each human, maximizing the fitness, intellectual and physical, of all individuals will result in productive capacity monumentally beyond a limited division of labor with specialization. The particulars of social planning of production redistribution are beyond the scope of this work, but there are a variety of potential texts for this, and when we get into the PowerPoint on this, I will try to put together, I will be putting together a list of some of the basic things that Marx and Engels call out. I won't be including necessarily all of this, but it will be there in some degree. But these are the recommended economic planning readings. As usual, you can pause the screen, or you could go into the description and pull out the Google Doc to take a look at these. But in general, I would recommend texts addressing the necessities brought forward by econophysics and critique of political economy and market socialism, ecological economics, the restoration of the metabolic rift and degrowth, or regrowth as I would term it, social architecture, urban and rural divide and design, participatory economics and other models around incentivizing labor without force, though I'm obviously not a supporter of Patriarchy, but I think that it's still useful to understand the varying methods of at least the managerial aspects of it, or the lack thereof, and how we can achieve economic democracy within workplaces and so on and so forth, and increase the amount of ability of the workers to have autonomous right and capacity to direct themselves for their own production. These are key to communism. Historic experiences with economic planning under models like the Soviet model, even if I would not agree that the Soviet model constituted as any form of socialism and they never went past commodity production, there's still things to learn about how they did their planning that is absolutely able to be implemented. The linear programming conception developed by Kantorovich in particular is one such example of this sort of economic planning that is certainly something, no matter what you understand about communist planning or even capitalist planning within state capitalist nations, can be utilized to extremely effective work. And this has, of course, developed over time as well. Many more have made works based on this. And developments within that, especially within the computer science area, which has simplified things massively. To put things into perspective, a single Raspberry Pi computer if we can call it that, could have calculated the entirety of the USSR's economy back in 1981. It's that powerful. Our calculation possibility is so high that we have no problems with doing proper planning. Continuing. And finally, cyber socialism, information theory, and systems theory, and so on. So yeah, varying texts, which I do recommend, but continuing. Engels then addresses the historic utopian socialist conceptions of the abolition between town and country, which emerged first before a critique of the division of labor, since the former was more evident as a symptom of a disease, which was brought to its highest form in manufacturing, which was developing at the time of the utopian socialists. In their conception, they abolished the division of labor first. They desired the scattering of populations, with each group living in a commune of limited numbers of people within a quote-unquote palace, in the center of an allotted amount of land of their use, later envisioned as some sort of arcology. The palaces themselves would act like a household run on communal lines, and would enter into voluntary relations with nearby palaces to eventually become a town. All members of the commune would be educated from childhood to be able to engage in any given kind of labor with a generalist and practical education, and would engage in both agriculture and industry, domestic labor being brought into industry, moving from activity to activity regularly in short shifts. Communism is distinct from this significantly, but still finds similar aims. Within communist society, the family will be completely transformed out of the conditions it currently is. This changing being made possible within capitalism due to the formation of the family, wherein women and children occupy necessary parts in socially organized processes of production outside of the domestic sphere. Education will be fully re-socialized, with the end of patriarchal relations and the liberty of women through the socialization of all labor. There will be real freedom in the mutual relations of all members of the family. Private domestic work is transformed into public industry with domestic labor, previously carried out principally by the women and children, instead being carried out by all society. And I wanted to go back to this for a second. Within the PowerPoint, I intend to create a section trying to express what society might look like with a developed communist mode of production with a new social architecture and the end of the division between town and country. And this will draw from various utopian socialist experiments like New Harmony. Also, I was interested in the superblocks of Barcelona and some of the social architecture aspects of that, though obviously these things very quickly fell into bourgeois, they were immediately part of bourgeois conceptions and led to essentially just market forces within it, but I think it's useful to look into it, or the Chinese Fujian Tulou, however you pronounce that, essentially walled town, so to speak. We don't need that, but I think that sort of communal living is of interest. The Shanghai Commune, solar punk, permaculture, symbiosis between organisms such as lichens and mycorrhiza, and then also various modern understandings of urbanism and design. And I found an interesting piece on customized collective housing towards a participatory design of dwellings. So these are all very interesting things which I think are useful to be looking for and reading about to get some sort of vision in your mind about what the future society will look like. But I do want to make it clear here that even though we are talking about the character of the communist mode of production according to Marx and Engels, we cannot make any absolute claims about things. We can only talk about the generalities and talk about an initial growth point and the laws of motion which will cause it to be developing. Where it develops with those new laws of motion, we can guess at in an educated manner, but specifics are not that case, right? we'll do the best that we can. And I'll try to express this as best as I can. But it is quite likely that I have a very myopic view. And this also doesn't take into account particular cultural varieties that happen within the various characteristics, right? Each different place is going to do its own thing to some degree. Anyway, continuing. Students will be taught in such a way that combines activity with learning. There is no division in reality between theory and practical activity, as theory informs and guides practice, while practice tests and refines theory. Artificial divisions are created by class society, which derives the need to present there being inherent differences between people, which justifies their own position. This education will be all-round, technical, and establish a foundation for scientific training such that all students are taught how to teach themselves and pursue self-education according to whatever field they happen to wish to develop themselves in. With the end of the division of labor, all aspects learned in tutelage become useful as compared to now, wherein the vast majority of the education one receives is rendered useless, as it is not pertinent to the specific social division of labor that anyone carries out, as everyone is limited through that division of labor to particular fields which never touch upon all others. In addition, in terms of the end of the division between town and country, communism utilizes a means of production with a social plan which replaces the division of labor, thus making it possible to transcend the division of town and country through a rational plan, whereby the productive forces are distributed wherein they are materially best adapted to their future development, maintenance, and development of other elements of production, for example, land. Productive forces will be distributed according to where they maximize their potential for production, which, under communism, also means maximization of human mental and physical development, and thus dignity and all other humanizing forces, their future development as needs increase, and their harmonization with everything else involved in production, and thus pollution is to be minimized, and the land invested in through the very act of producing upon it. And I think that a good comparison to make here, as a negative comparison, is every time a freaking tech billionaire comes in and says, I have a wonderful plan for a future society, and the example that I have is situated in the middle of a desert, on top of the fucking sand, out in the middle of nowhere, and it will operate like a company town, and also the living domiciles are literally no windows, and everybody has like pods and shit. And then it's got all these images of greenery and stuff in the middle of the desert on long cars and stuff. Where's your trains? No, everything's got to be cars, futuristic cars and stuff like that. It's the most ridiculous thing possible. That's not what it's going to be like when the associated producers who actually know what they're doing, because they're not some tech billionaire high off of their own farts. It's the actual people doing the work, and they know what it needs to be done. They know what they need, and they understand the bases of production of society, which is labor and time. And they understand that particular kinds of production are best suited to particular places, and it has nothing to do with the land rent value or anything along those matters. It matters about production. It matters about the labor that is going into it. Continuing. In fact, the end of the division of town and country also means that society needs to be able to recycle its waste of all kinds, rather than simply exporting waste and importing the products of other regions. Through a global system based not only the maximization of production through a planned economy, which supports the equitable development of the entire planet and all associated producers, production becomes fully liberated. Engels then compares Dühring's money and its place in society to Owen's labor money. Dühring's form in fact serves only as a mere labor certificate, evidencing the part an individual took in common labor and right to a portion of common produce intended for consumption. It is no more money than the ticket for a theater, and could even be expressed simply as a mathematical ledger held by society rather than by the individual. Thus, Dühring's conception is no different than Owen's when it trades within the limits of the economic commune and its members. It could function either as a direction of an obligation to produce or as a right to consume. There's no difference between the two from the perspective of production and distribution. This is as a result of the so-called quote-unquote undiminished proceeds of labor without accumulation. Ultimately, all that happens in the communes is effective bookkeeping, with equal labor for equal labor being applicable and exchange being maintained if in kind. Despite this, Dühring's is in fact regressive. Owen's labor notes can act as money through abuse and conversion. Dühring's is money that attempts to act as labor certificates. Owen's conception allows for its own abolition to a higher stage, whereas Dühring's naturally regresses into that same system he claimed to have escaped. Dühring's retains hoarding, speculation, exchange, and so on, and will naturally turn right back into the universal commodity. Owen's is much closer despite fundamental flaws, since it had the capacity to disappear should the Owenite society develop enough that they ceased having social use for it. In comparison, Marx's is the opposite. Hoarding ceases in any serious measure, speculation becomes functionally impossible, and exchange is not only impossible, but obsolete. Now, Engels addresses religion. He says that religion's origin lies in lack of control mankind has in regard to external forces which assert themselves in people's daily lives. The state itself emerges in similar conditions with the alienation of social power to the state to enforce power over the life activity of people on behalf of a ruling class. The same is the case with capital itself as well. This alienation is a dehumanizing condition which produces humans with lack of ability to take action of their own accord, except for those in place within particular sections of the division of labor imbued with this alienated power to take action on behalf of the need to reproduce the force's social power, thus further alienating all mankind. Thus, the lack of control people have, imbued with individual humans in this division of labor, takes on a social force, which appears both natural and necessary. This causes a transformation in these things, wherein religious figures as individuals, rather than as natural forces, emerge and represent abstract forces of history, or particular political figures like kings. Thus, the great man of history theory arises. In capitalism, in contrast, capital itself takes on the form of a real god, which enforces alienated domination through impersonal power over both the natural and social world. Thus, the basis for religious reflexivity reaches its peak within capitalism, that is, belief in sacrifice and prayers to capital, if merely in special words established by capital's priesthood division of labor, namely economists, but of course beyond that. Great man theory mostly dissipates because the individuals and social roles of reproducing capital don't matter, as those who do not perfectly embody capital's interests are replaced through the forces of competition. The cult becomes an end in itself. Mere knowledge does not rid humanity of religious belief, as knowledge does not bring social forces under the domination of society, rather than by alien forces, which is the aim of communism. In order to carry this out, society must bring all means of production under its direct control, use those productive forces on a planned basis, and free all society's members from the domination of dead labor over living labor. This is the only way to bring about an end to religion in all of its manifold forms. Within communist society, wherein though these are all achieved in conjunction with a scientific society, wherein the forces of nature are harnessed, mankind will finally be able to transcend religion in a material social act, rather than the dead end that is purely in the minds of individuals. Every time we socially validate capital through exchange, recognizing the commodity, being unable to directly see the social labor put into production of it, all hidden under the mystifying veil of that grand ecstasy that is the universal commodity money, we pay both tribute and worship to capital itself, spreading it all throughout all society and alienating everyone's agency into it, whether we want to or not. We paid blood sacrifice to the cult's altar. Communism is the only way to break the chains of the minds, bodies, and hearts of all of mankind from this fell power. And that is my summary of Engels' 1877 piece, Anti-Dühring, Herr Eugene Dühring's Revolution in Science, Part 3, Socialism. Thank you for joining me for today's topical summary. As usual, if you'd like to go over the quotations I derived the summary from, though I also added in my own embellishments to some degree, then please feel free to go to the description below in order to access a copy of this Google document. And also potentially consider joining the United Marxist Pact Discord server, which is also linked if you want to discuss this further with fellow communists. Anyway, thank you, and I hope to see you tomorrow, where we will be going over the 1879 piece, Interview with Karl Marx by the Chicago Tribune.